When I was 29, I learned that being forgotten by your own family doesn't always happen through a dramatic argument. Sometimes it happens quietly, behind a closed door, while the people you love divide up the life they built and decide you no longer belong in it. I discovered this on a rainy Thursday evening when I returned to my parents' house to pick up a box of old photographs, only to hear my father say from the study, "Your brother gets the company, the house, and the accounts, and Alina gets nothing because she's already made her choice." And in that instant, I realized my family had been planning my disappearance long before I knew I was being erased. My name is Clara Bennett, and growing up in the wealthy Bennett family meant learning very early that my older brother Marcus was considered the heir while I was treated like the relative who happened to live under the same roof. Because whenever Marcus won a school competition, my father took him to expensive restaurants, while my achievements were answered with a distracted smile and a reminder that real success meant joining the family construction business. I eventually stopped waiting for approval and moved from our small town in Vermont to Philadelphia, where I studied urban design, worked exhausting shifts at a cafe to pay rent, and slowly built a career restoring neglected buildings into beautiful, affordable spaces. Yet every time I called home, my mother asked whether I had finally grown out of that little career experiment, and my father asked whether Marcus needed anything. Years passed, and despite everything, I never completely stopped helping them, because when my father's construction company suffered a disastrous contract dispute, I quietly used my savings to cover several urgent invoices, and when my mother needed an expensive procedure that insurance wouldn't fully cover, I paid the remaining medical costs without asking for recognition or even telling Marcus what I had done. I convinced myself that family didn't keep score, but deep down I was still hoping that one day my parents would look at me and see more than the daughter who had left, because I didn't want their money or their company. I wanted the simple feeling that my presence mattered as much as my brother's. That illusion finally collapsed during a Sunday dinner when my parents invited me home under the excuse of discussing the future of the family business. And instead of discussing my ideas, my father casually announced that Marcus would become the sole owner while I would receive nothing because, according to him, "You chose your own life, Clara, so don't expect to inherit ours." I looked across the table at my mother, waiting for her to challenge him, but she lowered her eyes and whispered, "Your father has already decided." And when Marcus smiled as though he'd just been handed a kingdom, something inside me stopped fighting for a place that had never truly been offered. I left before dessert, drove through the cold night with the windshield wipers beating like a metronome, and spent the entire journey home asking myself how many times I had confused obligation with love. But the real shock came the next morning when my mother sent me a message saying, "Please don't come back here again, and don't call us for a while. Marcus needs us united." I stared at those words for several minutes, placed my phone beside my untouched coffee, and answered only, "Understood," because for the first time I wasn't interested in arguing with people who had already made their decision. Instead of falling apart, I opened an old project file sitting on my desk, a redevelopment concept I had designed for abandoned industrial properties along the Delaware waterfront, and I realized that the plan my parents had dismissed months earlier could become something far larger than a rejected family proposal. I called a former colleague named Daniel Reyes, who now worked with a nonprofit investment group, and when I told him I wanted to turn several empty warehouses into affordable creative studios, small businesses, and community spaces, he went silent for a moment before saying, "Clara, if your numbers are as strong as your vision, I think you may have just found your next chapter." 3 weeks later, I was standing inside a freezing warehouse with cracked windows, exposed brick, and years of dust covering the concrete floor. But instead of seeing a ruined building, I saw possibilities everywhere, and Daniel saw them too when he helped me present the proposal to a regional development fund. The meeting lasted less than an hour, yet by the time I walked outside, I had received the news I had secretly dreamed about for years. The fund wanted to finance the first phase of my project, and the same woman my family had described as impractical was suddenly responsible for leading a multi-million-dollar redevelopment initiative. Then Marcus called, not to congratulate me, but to accuse me of trying to compete with the family business after hearing through a mutual acquaintance that my project had attracted major investors. And his voice changed completely when I calmly told him that my company had nothing to do with his. "You always needed attention," he snapped, and I replied, "No, Marcus, I spent years needing permission. There's a difference." Before ending the conversation and realizing that I didn't feel guilty afterward, which was perhaps the clearest sign that I had finally broken free. 6 months later, the situation at my parents' company began unraveling because Marcus had expanded 2 quickly signed contracts he couldn't fulfill and made several risky financial decisions that left the business struggling with debt, while my father, who had once proudly called him the future, suddenly started calling me with questions about investors and restructuring. I didn't celebrate their problems, and I didn't offer to rescue them either, because I had finally learned that saving someone from every consequence can prevent them from ever learning how to stand on their own. The call that changed everything came from my mother on a snowy evening when she admitted that my father had been wrong about me, that Marcus had been given opportunities because they were afraid to challenge him, and that they had mistaken my independence for rejection because I refused to follow the path they had chosen for me. "I don't know if you can forgive us," she said through tears, and I answered honestly, "I don't know either, Mom, but forgiveness doesn't mean I have to return to the life that hurt me," before telling her that I would consider rebuilding a relationship slowly, on new terms, without money, guilt, or expectations. A year after that painful dinner, I stood outside the first completed building of my redevelopment project while dozens of small businesses prepared to open their doors. And for the first time, I understood that losing my family's approval had not destroyed my future. It had forced me to build one that belonged entirely to me. My parents eventually visited the project, and while our relationship remained complicated, I no longer needed their applause, because the woman who once sat silently at a family table wondering why she wasn't enough had become someone who could look at everything she had built and know the answer without asking anyone else. The strangest part is that I never got revenge, at least not in the dramatic way people imagine, because I didn't buy their company, humiliate Marcus, or stand outside their house celebrating their failures. I simply stopped chasing people who had decided my worth was conditional, protected my peace, built meaningful work, and learned that sometimes the greatest victory isn't making the people who rejected you regret their decision, but reaching a place where their decision no longer controls how you see yourself. And if you've ever been made to feel like the forgotten child, the unwanted sibling, or the person who could never measure up, remember that being overlooked by the wrong people does not make you invisible. You may simply be standing in a room that was never big enough for what you were capable of becoming, and please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.